This online lecture covers the Gothic period. It's important before you watch this lecture to be sure, if you were assigned, to have watched the architecture sketchbook lecture before watching this one. That lecture contains some terminology that you will find useful to understanding the ideas presented in this lecture. Now, the Gothic period is one of these really unique periods in early art history where we can actually make a pretty specific designation in terms of when the style began. So specific that actually we can say the year, down to the actual year and down to the actual region. The Gothic period originated in northern France in the year 1140. Now, the end date of the style of approximately 1400 is a little bit more loose because the Gothic style was an international style that began and ended in different places in Europe at different times. But it did begin in northern France in the year 1140. Now, I keep saying northern France, and that's because northern France is specific. We can't just say France in this instance. The reason why is because it is in the northern area of France that the Gothic style in its most purest iteration is existing. When the Gothic style leaves northern France and it spreads to southern France and other areas of Europe, it no longer is that pure Gothic approach that we see in northern France. What happens is when the Gothic style leaves northern France to go to southern France and other areas of Europe, we see that the style becomes mixed with Romanesque influences and specific regional influence as well. And we'll definitely see that that's the case later on in lecture when we look at English Gothic architecture. Now, a few things about the Gothic style. In terms of context, the style coincided with the rise of wealth and power within the French monarchy. And we've seen this many times in this class, this idea that a monarchy, ruling family, or even simply some sort of territory has extra money, they're in a time of peace, that is invested into incredible art and architecture. The Gothic period is the rise of the cathedrals, so they're using their extra wealth to build these larger church structures that do not have a rival in size. We haven't seen something as large and majestic and as soaring as the churches built during this period. And you will certainly see that during this lecture as well. The other thing just to mention briefly is the name Gothic. The name Gothic was a term that was coined by Giorgio Vasari. Many people think that Giorgio Vasari was the first art historian. I personally disagree with that. I find that he's more of an artist biographer. I personally think that the first art historian was Johann Winckelmann, which was in the 19th century. Anyhow, I digress. Giorgio Vasari, he comes up with the Gothic style, and it's meant to be a negative term. It's pejorative, and he thinks that the Gothic style is ugly, it's barbaric. He names it after the Goths, and what really got sort of a bee in Vasari's bonnet was the fact that he felt that the Gothic period was turning away from classical influence, and that's why it was such an ugly style. You can decide for yourself if you want to agree with Vasari or not. I personally disagree. I think the Gothic style is beautiful. And I think you will agree seeing some really beautiful art in this lecture. Okay, so we start with Saint Denis. And we start with Saint Denis because this supposedly was the cathedral that started it all. Now, Saint Denis was not initially constructed in the Gothic period. It actually was initially built in the Romanesque period. And it had been built in a previous time, a Carolingian basilica to be more precise. And what happened was, because it had been built so long ago in the Carolingian period, it was old, it was in disrepair. The other thing, though, was it was too small. The Saint Denis Cathedral is the royal cathedral of the royal family. So this is an important cathedral. It's going to need to be big, it's going to be large in size to effectively pronounce the power of the royal family that's using it. So there certainly was a need for expansion and renovation. So what the royal family did is they brought in this guy named Abbot Suger. His name kind of looks like it's spelled sugar, S-U-G-E-R, but it's pronounced Suger. And he's kind of like the father of Gothic architecture. Your textbook does a really good job of talking about Suger, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about him. It'll be sufficient for you to read about him in your textbook. He's a brilliant man, he's visionary, and he pretty much comes up with the Gothic style. That's pretty legit in my opinion. Now, before we talk about what some of the things that Suger presents, we do want to talk about Saint Denis a little bit further in terms of function. So I already mentioned that it was the official church of the royal family, so it had the function of acting as a space for them to worship. This also was the burial site of some of the more prominent members of the royal family. This also was Saint Denis, and Denis was the patron saint of France. He was credited with initially bringing Christianity to France, a venture that for him earned him a martyr's death. And then finally, this cathedral held a really important relic. It held a banner that once belonged to Charlemagne. And we know that Charlemagne is one of the superstars of the Middle Ages. And who is the other superstar? If you said Constantine, you are correct. So anyhow, the church is remodeled in the Gothic style. Now, I'm not going to mention all of the characteristics of the Gothic style here. In fact, a lot of the architectural characteristics I've already mentioned in the architecture sketchbook lecture. But I do want to talk really quickly about the pointed arch, because this is something that's very important. Now, the pointed arch was not invented in the Gothic period. We saw examples of the pointed arch in the Romanesque period. But I would rather you associate the pointed arch with the Gothic period because its use was much more widespread and it had a more specific structural function in the Gothic period than it did in the preceding Romanesque period. I put in this drawing that somebody made that gives you an idea of why the pointed arch is so important. Now, when it comes to Gothic structures, the idea is to make these structures bigger and bigger and bigger than preceding structures, which means that there needs to be a lot of care taken in how to bear the weight. If you're going to have a taller structure, you're going to use more material, it's going to be heavier. How do we solve that problem? Well, one of the ways that the problem is solved is by using the pointed rather than the rounded arch. It has to do with weight distribution. If you look at the pointed arch, you can look up here at the top and you see that there's a larger surface area at the very top of the arch. What happens is you can see with my arrow that I'm moving around here that the weight bears down and there's a larger area of surface that bears the weight. Because there's a larger area, that is going to become weakened over time because it has the responsibility of bearing weight. But if you see at the pointed arch, the weight hits down at the point and it's distributed along the sides. So it actually makes for a stronger arch. It's a really simple concept, but brilliant at the same time. All right, now another really important art form that we see in the Gothic period is stained glass. Okay, now stained glass, this is important because this kind of carries along with things we've been talking about this semester. Stained glass becomes the primary mode of interior decoration within the church. Now, what this is showing us is that we've seen a change over time. We saw initially that what type of material is used to adorn the interior of a church in the early Christian and the Byzantine periods. Now, if you guessed mosaics, you're correct. So these replace the mosaics. Now also though, remember we have the Romanesque period, the preceding Romanesque period. Do you remember what is used for interior decoration in the Romanesque period? If you guess structural embellishment, you're correct. So we go from mosaics to structural embellishments, things like pillars, pilasters, moldings, etc. And now we have stained glass. Now, stained glass during the Gothic period is very specific in that they utilize primarily the colors of blue and red. These are the primary colors that they're using. And they're actually primary colors. they're the main colors that they use. And the reason why is because, as you know from our discussions of design principles from the beginning of the semester, that blue is a cool color, warm color is red. So we have a warm, cool color contrast that helps to make certain areas of the composition distinct. And this is important because these windows are being seen from a distance. Now what we're looking at is we are actually looking at a clerestory window. And I kind of like how this slide is dark because this actually is kind of an accurate idea of how these windows would look, and how the interior would look. You would imagine that, oh, there's all these windows everywhere, that it would be, light filled. But no, there actually is not a lot of light that enters through these windows. And the idea is that it creates this kind of like dark, mysterious interior where you have like shafts of colored light that kind of stream down onto the people that are in the nave. And so we've talked about this idea of, what kind of artistic strategies are employed so that artists can create these really mysterious kind of enthralling interiors that function to enhance or complement the spiritual experience. And these fulfill that function. Now, these windows fulfill an additional function, and that additional function is that they are narratives. So a lot of people at this time still are illiterate. They do not read the Bible. At this point in time, the Bible is still being, in Latin. A lot of people aren't reading Latin. So this is a way to bring religious narratives into into image so that people could follow along, and it brings a new way to interact with these religious narratives. So what's the religious narrative that we see here? We're seeing the Virgin and Child. And what motif is this that we see in the middle? Now, if you guess Throne of Wisdom, you are correct. And my next question for you is, what period does the Throne of Wisdom motif originate? If you guess Byzantine, you are correct. Now, we actually have a dual motif here. We do have Throne of Wisdom, which, as we know, is characterized by Mary acting as the virtual throne of man-baby Jesus, homunculus Jesus, which we see here. The additional motif, though, is a new one that we haven't seen yet in this class, Mary, Queen of Heaven. And it's this idea of Mary as young and beautiful, and also this idea of her being like a queen. This idea of Mary is very young and beautiful. This is established in the Gothic period, and this becomes the sort of common, consistent way that Mary is represented in art. From here on out, even today in contemporary images of Mary, she's very young, she's very beautiful. Now, how you can tell it's Mary, Queen of Heaven is look for some sort of royal iconography. We have a crown here, so that indicates. Oftentimes you'll see the fleur-de-lis, which is the three-part flower that is evocative or indicative of the royal family of France. Now, let's talk about patronage. Patronage is important. We know from our discussion from the Romanesque period that these churches did need to engage to some extent in revenue-generating practices. These were very expensive churches to build. And so we talked about how they would rent out or sell radiating chapels, that kind of thing. Well, in this case, we have these stained glass windows, many of which were purchased or sponsored by guilds, or in this case, the Queen of France. Is this a coincidence that the Queen of France would commission this specific subject matter? I don't think so. I really don't. This idea that she's a queen, here's Mary, Mary's a queen, it's a way for her to kind of equate herself or sort of associate herself with Mary. And that's a way to suggest power. We have seen this strategy all the way back since Egypt. This idea that if rulers want to communicate power, they associate themselves with high-ranking deities or religious figures. The Queen of France, she's simply just continuing on with this idea. All right. Now we're moving on to the early and the high Gothic periods, we do actually have two different iterations of the Gothic style. We have an earlier style, which is represented here with this cathedral on the right, and then this is the high Gothic period over here on the left. The early one obviously comes first, the high comes later. So you might ask, what are the differences between the early and the high Gothic period? There's really only two that I'm concerned with you learning about, and it's kind of easy. One of them, this is the easy one, fancy. The high Gothic period has a fancier architecture. You can compare these two, you can totally see it. You have like all this extra embellishment here, up in here, all around here. Even look at the rose window and the tracery. How the tracery here is much more detailed, much more dense in this linear patterning. It's super gorgeous. So fancier. Actually, there's three things. I thought of a third one, but it's easy too. Another one is size. We tend to see high Gothic structures larger in size. The way that we can tell this in this comparison is look at the bottom and look at people to give you a sense of scale. Here's some people. Look at these people in the doorway. Okay, compared to this. Look how high this is. This is crazy. Super high doorway. So taller. And then finally, the third difference is there's a general lack of asymmetry in the high Gothic style. And you can see this. This is symmetrical. And that's because in the early Gothic period, there's still a lot of influence coming from the Romanesque period. And we know that the Romanesque period prioritizes symmetry, because that was something that was seen in ancient Roman architecture. Here, when you divide it in half, we have two different westwork. So a lack of symmetry. Now, I said a general lack of symmetry because it's not like every single structure is asymmetrical. But you know this. You know the rule in art history. Never say never and never say always, because there's always exceptions. Now, I'd like to show you detail. I'm going to show you detail of this sculpture right here. And this is Christ, or beautiful God. Oftentimes it's referred to as Beau Dieu, which is the French term, beautiful God. Don't worry about it, just Christ, beautiful God. It's totally fine. This type of sculpture is called a trumeau. Here's your spelling right here. And if I can go back for a moment just to show you, the trumeau is located in the middle of the two doors of the portal. So in the architecture sketchbook lecture, we talked about portal architecture. We talked about the jam figures, which are right here. What's this called? This is a tympanum, or tympanum, tomato. I like to say tympanum. And then this right here is the trumeau. These are the three features of the portal that you're going to need to know for your final exam. So here's a close-up. So, beautiful God. Here's the situation. So we have Jesus, and he's standing here, and he's standing on a lion and a basilisk, which symbolize the evil forces of the world. So he's like dominating him, stamping him out. But what's important is take a look at Jesus, okay? Think about the evolution of Jesus throughout time. We know that since the Byzantine period, Jesus has been mean and grumpy and scary. Right? Grumpy Jesus. We see in the Gothic period a change in the way that Jesus is represented in what I like to call nice guy Jesus. He's friendly. He has his arm raised in a traditional gesture of blessing that dates back to early Christian period. As people are walking in, it's a lot different than in the Romanesque period. Remember that tympanum that we looked at? Right, the Last Judgment. So instead of you walking up to a church and they're saying, hey, you better come in or you're going to get dragged to hell through the open mouth of a demon, now Jesus is saying, hey, hello, welcome. And I think that's nice. Handsome, nice guy Jesus. This becomes the standard representation of Jesus from here on out. So interestingly, the standard representation of both Jesus and Mary happen in the early or high Gothic period. That part doesn't matter, just high Gothic, or Gothic, I mean. So, standardized representations in the Gothic period. Alright, let's move on. Here we have another super fantastic example of the High Gothic period, and I'm actually wanting to concentrate more so on the sculptures that are part of this, but I just wanted to show you the exterior from afar so you can see how crazy things are getting in terms of height. Here's some people to give you a sense of scale. Look how dramatic and large these entries are. The entryways have become so large in size that an entire rose window has been put in here, replacing the tympanum. And all of the sculpture that we would have anticipated seeing there in the tympanum is located up here. And then you can see the rest of the exterior is just like every square inch covered in sculpture. It's pretty incredible. So here, speaking of incredible, are some sculptures that are on this cathedral. The reason why I would show you these is because this is a very exciting moment in the history of art. Very exciting. This is when we start to see the Middle Ages beginning to end in terms of art history. We know that the Middle Ages is a time when art kind of languishes. There's not a lot of gains being made. There's not a lot of sophistication. There's not a lot of experimentation or innovation, which is hard. That's a hard thing when you are looking at Greek Hellenistic art, which is like the best of the best, and then you move on to work that in comparison I would say is kind of subpar. This is when we start to move away from this. This is when we start to see artists taking tentative steps to what will eventually become the Renaissance, which is the complete rebirth of art. It's a super exciting time that we unfortunately do not cover in this class, but you can take the second survey and you can learn about it. This is a great example of how these changes are occurring. Here's these jam figures from the Chartres Cathedral. And the Chartres Cathedral dates to the early Gothic period. In the early Gothic period, we see that sculpture is pretty much just carrying on the traditions of Romanesque sculpture. We see elongated form. We see the stylized drapery. The only thing that's missing, what do you think? The diagonal lines. We don't see the diagonal lines. Otherwise, though, we have these like really kind of like generic figures. They're elongated. The proportions are not anatomically accurate. The sculptures are stiff. They're just kind of staring out. We have no sense of like psychology or individuality. That's just the way it is. But here, things begin to change. What do you see that's different? I hope that you saw the contrapposto stance, okay? Poking forward knee. This is exciting. This is the reemergence of the contrapposto stance. We have not seen the contrapposto stance since the classical period. It's not used in the Middle Ages. Now we see it making its return. What is the effect of the contrapposto stance? It's the shifting of weight to make the body look informal in its position, which is actually a more accurate way to represent form than just kind of stiff with knees locked. So we have the weight shift principle. We have these women here that are standing in a relaxed and informal way that allows for the artist to show the body in a more realistic fashion. This is exciting. Realism is returning to art. You want to know what else is exciting? The drapery. The drapery, too, is also realistic. Now, maybe there's a little stylization in there, but not very much at all. It's not like here where it's like perfectly patterned, straight lines. That is not at all indicative of the natural way that cloth interacts with the body. This is much more realistic. The cloth bunches, it folds, it's irregular. It works to reveal the form of the body underneath. The other thing that's really exciting is we do have a little bit of psychology here. We have these women that look like they're conversing, that there's an interaction, and it's not just like generic people staring out into space. This is exciting as well. This idea of expressing emotion was not seen in the Middle Ages, and the reason why is because that's a little too personal and it's a little too individual. In the Middle Ages, the emphasis is on the collective. The collective who belong to the church, who come together to do, the things that Christianity wants them to do. This is important because when we get into the pre-Renaissance, which again this class is not covering, in the pre-Renaissance and certainly in the Renaissance itself, individuality becomes much more of a focus rather than collective identity. This kind of is suggesting that people are starting to think about this now. Some people like to say that the High Gothic period is the pre-Renaissance. I personally don't agree with that, but that doesn't really matter. Let's move on. This is just a little treat for you because this is gorgeous. This gives you an idea of the extent of stained glass usage inside the Gothic cathedrals. This is Sainte-Chapelle, which is located right across from the very famous Notre Dame in Paris. This is the private chapel of Louis IX, and he built this above another chapel, and this is like the special chapel that's only for him and his family. So again, this idea, we saw this kind of at the Palatine Chapel in Aachen that was used by Charlemagne, the idea of the ruler being sort of lifted up or above everyone else worshiping as a way to indicate hierarchy. So he has this built, and it's not only built just for him and like his super fancy private place to worship. He actually built this as well to house some relics that he purchased. And these relics were pretty legit. He got a piece of the true cross, so a piece of the cross that Jesus was crucified on, the crown of thorns that Jesus wore when he was crucified, a nail that was put into Jesus when he was crucified on the cross, and the lance that stabbed Jesus when he was on the cross. I mean, these are like the superstars of relics. And this is a way to really show how powerful Louis IX was, that he was able to spend that money to have these like objects that are the most important objects in like all of Christianity that he just gets to keep for his own private enjoyment in his super fancy Sainte-Chapelle cathedral, or chapel technically. It's pretty amazing. Speaking of amazing, let's talk about the stained glass. You can see, and I talked a little bit about this in the architecture sketchbook lecture, that the idea is as time passes, that these the walls dissolve and more stained glass is incorporated. And here we can see it taken to the max, where the entire wall is made up of stained glass. Stained glass makes up, here's a little some little numbers for you. Stained glass makes up 3/4, 75% of the entire structure. There is about 6,500 square feet of stained glass. Each window is approximately 50 feet tall. These are the largest stained glass windows to ever have been made at the time. And these glass walls, in succession, depict the full biblical story of humanity. Now you might wonder, how is this structurally possible? You already know the answer to that if you watch the architecture sketchbook lecture. What's on the outside? Flying buttresses. That's what makes it possible. The walls do not need to bear the weight because the weight is being borne externally with the flying buttresses. Okay, we're moving on, and we're going to be leaving France. So all that we were looking at was in France. Now we're going to look at English Gothic, and then we're going to end the lecture talking a little bit about German Gothic sculpture. Now, English Gothic, okay? Now we know because England is outside of northern France that this is a type of Gothic style where you have not the pure style, but you have the Gothic style mixed with regional influences and Romanesque influences. What I'd like for you to do is I would like for you to pause this video and see if you can determine what is different between these two structures. That what might be more Romanesque that you see here. Now hopefully you've done that. what we see, there's a reason why I've picked these two for comparison. The emergence of the English Gothic style coincides with the High Gothic period. So these are appropriate to compare. Now, if we look here, okay, let's talk about what is English, what's uniquely English. First of all, we have the symmetry. And we know that symmetry is a feature of the Romanesque style. If you compare this, we see a regular westwork. Here, perfectly symmetrical. That's English. The other thing that we see here that's English, that also, by the way, is Romanesque, is that this structure is wider and heavier rather than taller and thinner. Part of that has to do with the division of the facade. This is a typical 3-part facade division. Here you'll notice it's a 5-part. By dividing it into 5 components, it helps to emphasize the width. And this is really not as tall. These are like little baby pointy westworks. They don't extend up. And even like the portal does not even compare to its French counterpart. So those are really the big ones that I would say. Now in terms of similarity, fancy. Fancy with both of them. Let's take a look at the interior. Now the interior, this is more Romanesque in the sense that it's heavy and that the design actually has a horizontal influence, or I guess like a horizontal thrust. It moves this way rather than vertical. And there's a comparison in here where it'll make this much more apparent. So we have a really heavy horizontal design. We have structural embellishment that makes up the interior rather than overt reliance on stained glass. And what's different, though, between what we would see in the Romanesque period is we see actually the use of 2 different colored stones, this darker and this lighter. The darker is used to emphasize visually those structural embellishments that we know are, part of the design. Like, for example, the ribs. What type of vault is this? Rib groin. The ribs on a rib groin vault are made apparent with the use of the stone. What's this part right here? It's a gallery. We have looks like what look like compound piers, or maybe compound pillars that make up. That's the darker stone. You get the drift. Here's a comparison. Now, there is a early and high English Gothic style, but we actually give them specific style names. Salisbury Cathedral is an example of the decorated style, which is the early Gothic style. The high or later, perpendicular. Now this can be confusing because the perpendicular style, the high style, just like in France, it's fancier. So you'd think, oh, well, we should call the decorated style this one because it's fancier. It's not that way. I don't know why. It just is what it is. So, this is more Romanesque in its influence. This is more Gothic. Okay? Now, we talked about the horizontal, right? You can see how there's this horizontal movement. Here, you can see it's vertical. The eye is being brought up. It's a vertical influence. And that's actually why this is called perpendicular. Now, this is weird, I personally think, but this is why it's called perpendicular. That these linear emphasis, vertical linear emphasis, is perpendicular to the horizontality of the nave. The nave is horizontal, perpendicular to the vertical. That's supposedly why. Now, with the perpendicular style, I want to talk about the emergence of a regional attribute that is distinctly English, and that is the vaults. Take a look at the vault. It's super gorgeous, right? Super organic. Looks like trees that are growing up, sort of extending over the vault, which underneath, by the way, is a barrel vault. This is unique to English architecture at the outset. If you were taking a final and you saw a vault like this, you would automatically know it's English. We don't see these types of vaults in France. We don't see them anywhere else in Europe at the time. All right, moving on to German. I'm skipping German architecture because I don't think there's anything that's really that different or anything super significant to talk about. If we're going to pick something significant to talk about coming out of Germany in the Gothic period, it's their sculpture. So here we have a tympanum sculpture, Death of the Virgin. And what makes this significant, what makes this different than anything we've seen since Hellenistic period Greece is emotion. And it's actually pretty emotional emotion. And this is brilliant because we're looking at a subject that's inherently sad. The Virgin has died. This is a sad thing. And we have these people who've come, the disciples who've come to mourn the loss. There's Jesus here. Yes, we know that Jesus is predeceased Mary. He's come down from heaven to mourn her loss. This little person is actually the soul of Mary. He's going to go ahead and take with him up to heaven. This is Mary Magdalene here in the front. So it's super sad. What the artist does is it uses composition as well as attributes of form and facial expression to convey emotion. Now, the facial expressions in the gesture, that's like not too much of a stretch. I mean, this is unique. It's amazing that you see these people in varying stages and varying responses of grief. Like what we saw at the visitation sculptures, this is showing that there is individuality. People are responding to grief in different ways. But what I think is smart is the artist uses the composition to convey emotion as well. This composition is super phoby. There's all these people that are cramped in. It's really tight. It's like really claustrophobic and overwhelming. So much so that they're kind of shoved in. This guy's head's like perpendicular to his neck. Very uncomfortable, contorted position. These uncomfortable, contorted positions, these crowded compositions, are meant to create that sense of being uncomfortable, of experiencing grief. Oftentimes when we experience a high level of grief, there is physical discomfort that comes along with that. And we're seeing that being alluded to in this tympanum sculpture. Now I just want to bring in one more. This is the Röntgen Pietà. This is another example of this really emotional and at the same time kind of awkward German Gothic sculpture. Now, really quickly, I want to say, okay, that the Pietà is not the same as Throne of Wisdom. With Throne of Wisdom, we have Mary with man-baby Jesus. He's a baby. He has to be a baby to be Throne of Wisdom. When he's the man Jesus, Pietà. The story is that Jesus has been removed from the cross. His mother holds him, and she's saying her final goodbyes before he's laid to rest in his tomb. This is a pretty gruesome image. We have like gaping wounds or like bleeding with flesh coming out. This type of gore we really have not pretty much ever, well, I shouldn't say ever. The Mesopotamians like to do a lot of images with decapitation and stuff, but it's pretty gory. We'll just put it that way. But you can see the awkward position where it's almost like his neck has like been broken. The head hangs back in this really uncomfortable way. Again, is to kind of instill a sense of tension within the viewer. Now, in terms of proportion, there's an interesting thing happening. You might notice that Mary has a giant head. The giant head is there to emphasize Mary's face. And what do you see when you see Mary's face? You see this really, really sad expression of emotion. This is what makes German Gothic sculpture unique in comparison to the sculpture being produced in England as well as France during this time. We don't see this type of emotion. And in fact, we really don't see it again until the incredible and the amazing Giotto of pre-Renaissance Italy begins to use emotion in a very exciting way.